Hello and welcome to our panel. My name is Greg Bell. I'm a co-founder of an open source security company called Corelight, and I will be your moderator today. It's not a secret that we're recording this in advance this year, so please put your questions in chat. We'll be here to answer them and to engage with those questions in real time and potentially after the panel as well. But if you have questions and they occur to you while we're talking, please ask and we'll be happy to engage then. Now, the idea for this panel came from a tweet that I happened to see last year. It was from Purdue University, celebrating the accomplishments of a student, a young woman who worked on their cybersecurity team. While she was there, she added an open source intrusion detection system to the university's research network based on open source Zeek. And here's what the university's tweet said. This experience helped Lauren land a career as a technical program manager at Facebook. And I thought when I saw the tweet, that's a fantastic story. And it actually made me wonder if there might be some really interesting angles on open source that are not getting enough attention. There is a lot of discussion, ample discussion on open source tooling, open source technology, open source business models, a little bit less attention, I think, to the impact of open source communities on the careers of the people and the lives of the people who get involved in them. But that's an important story, and those impacts can be transformative. So we thought we'd explore that in this panel. What we're going to do today is focus attention on a powerful but little discussed benefit of open source communities, and that is to serve as a force for social mobility and career transformation. It's my honor here to be joined by four very compelling, accomplished friends and colleagues who have agreed to reflect on this topic together. You can read about their bios on the RSA website. They're most impressive. I won't repeat that here. I will ask them to introduce themselves briefly when they first speak. But let's just jump right into the discussion because we have 30 minutes or just a little bit over. So I think to get us started, I would like to ask a couple of panelists to explain the impact of open source software in their own careers, just for 3 or 4 minutes each. And I think I'll start with Bernard Brantley. So over to you, Bernard.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Greg. Great introduction. So the impact of open source on my career. I'm happy to say that without open source, I would not be here today. I don't think I'd be in security at all. I'd come to a point in my life where I needed something different, and all the things that I had been doing before weren't working. However, I can't abide by the thought process that what's always worked will work, and because we've always done it this way, you should too. I got into open source by finding a project online called Snort, which sent me down the path of discovery to understand exactly what impact security would have on the networks that we have come to operate in. I found that the great thing about open source technology was that I could take what I wanted from that and learn and grow as I needed. I always thought of myself as a dreamer, which means I spent a lot of time exploring different thoughts, exploring different opportunities. And what open source allowed me to do is to follow that while applying my own uniqueness and my own experience to the outcomes that would come out of my application of that open source project to the things that I wanted to learn and do. What it afforded me was the opportunity to just go pick something up that I was interested in and read about it until I learned enough to actually go and start executing. And so as I've moved through my career, I've looked for opportunities to do exactly that in the businesses that I've been a part of. I've looked to build something that gives people the opportunity to take experiences that others have had, apply them, learn enough to become effective, but leave enough ramp for them to grow and to continue on to build something that was unexpected. I like to think that through open source, I've been able to leave the businesses that I've been a part of and the projects that I've worked in a better place than when I started.
Thanks, Bernard. That was inspiring. And I know I said we wouldn't go deeply into bio, but maybe you could mention a couple of the small companies you've worked for, because I think they'll be of interest to the people listening to the panel.
Well, you know, I've been in some interesting places. I was able to instrument in networks at both Microsoft and Amazon, and I'm now working as a CISO. So this
Yeah.
is great space.
Thanks so much. Okay, let's turn now to Doug Burks. And I think many of you will be familiar with Doug's name and his impact on the open source world, but I thought it'd be great to ask him for his own reflection on how open source has changed his professional career.
Thanks, Greg. I'm Doug Burks. I'm the founder and CEO of Security Onion Solutions. And I was introduced to free and open source software in 1997. And it absolutely changed the entire trajectory of my career and perhaps my life. I grew up on computers, and I kind of had this mindset of commercial software. And when I found that there was this entire sort of parallel universe of free and open source software, it was absolutely a revelation. And so I got deeply entrenched in the world of free and open source software, and first kind of starting off with every single Linux distribution under the sun and getting my feet wet with Linux, and then getting involved in individual projects along the way. And, over the years, I got more and more focused on intrusion detection and network security monitoring. And as Bernard was talking about, Snort is a great example of kind of a gateway drug to, a world of open source intrusion detection products. And so after getting involved with that project and several others, including Suricata and Bro, which is now Zeek, I really came to the point where I said, well, attackers, red teamers, they have what was previously called Backtrack Linux, now called Kali Linux. But at the time, back in 2008, there really was no blue team or defender equivalent of Backtrack Linux or Kali Linux. And so I kind of set out to build that. So let's build a defender platform. So I called it Security Onion. And over the years, it kind of grew and grew and grew into this worldwide community. And that helped me to transition my career from some of the organizations that I had worked in that were great places to work. But ultimately, I got an opportunity to go and work at Mandiant, a really great cybersecurity company. And it was through open source that really kind of led to that connection. That really kind of led to that kind of opportunity. And then ultimately, after a few more years, kind of as the worldwide community of Security Onion users continued to grow, and the demand continued to increase, it just became time to really take a leap of faith and turn that into a company. And so in 2014, I did exactly that. I started Security Onion Solutions, and we've grown every year since then. And very happy to say that, based on free and open source software, we're now able to support many families in my hometown of Augusta, Georgia, and many other states throughout the country. So it's been absolutely amazing to be on this journey of free and open source software, really kind of taking me to places that I never thought I could go.
Yeah, thanks so much, Doug. That leap of faith that you describe is familiar to me too. It's exhilarating. It's a little scary. For those who don't know in the audience about the impact of Security Onion, I think I read a statistic that when a new release comes out, there's an enormous number of downloads of the ISO. Do you have a rough sense of how many folks download Security Onion when a new release comes out?
So I don't know the individual download counts for each release off the top of my head, but I can tell you that our total number of downloads to date is over 2 million.
Wow, that's impact. Thank you so much. All right, so it was very interesting, I think, to hear about the impact of open source, free and open source software on those two separate careers. And after hearing about those stories, I think our audience may be wondering, how can I get started? I mean, those careers sound kind of magnificent from a distance, right? It's always more difficult in real time as you work through them, as you take the leap of faith, as you make the risky decision to start a company or to embed open source in a project that you're grappling with at work. So I thought I would ask a few of our panelists, how to get started with open source. Fatima, could you begin by introducing yourself and also giving a little bit of advice about how to get started?
Thanks. Thanks, Greg. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Fatima and I'm a security engineer at ESNet. So I started my open source journey with my first job, and it was a job requirement for me. And at that time, I was pretty new to the business, and I was like, I don't know anything about it. And the requirement was I was asked to write Zeek scripts. At that time, we still use Zeek NSM in our environment. So I was asked specifically to focus on writing some Zeek scripts to enhance the detection of the project. And I started doing that. I started exploring, okay, what is Zeek and how can I get started and what all is available out there and how can I read through it. And then sooner or later, I joined the mailing list of the group and I started asking lots and lots of questions. I mean, all the dumb sort of questions that one can think of, I have asked it on the mailing list. So that's how I got started. And I always felt like my background, even though it's software development background, but my role was security engineer. And I was not looking for building something up. I was looking for using something that can actually help my work and grow me in my current job. So there's this misconception that if you are a developer, then only you can actually start contributing to an open source project, which is not true because you can contribute in many different ways, and there are different kind of levels which you can actually go ahead and contribute to depending on your interest and the time you have. So you can be a tester if you do not want to know anything in the background that what is happening behind the curtains of a project. You can actually run the project on your environment and see if you can find some bugs, and you can file a really good bug report, which would be super powerful to the project team because they are desperately in need of, some projects are desperately in need of somebody who can test their code, right? So you can be a tester. You can write, if you want to use it, and if you become a pro user of the product, then you can involve more people in using it and getting them started with how you started with the project. So this is another kind of contribution you can make. You can start growing the user community for that project. And then there is another important aspect of it. Like if you really are into writing stuff, like you are great in writing, you can share your knowledge. You can write blog posts that, oh, this is the cool thing I found about this project. And I was using this project to detect this and find this. And people find those kind of stories very impressive and interesting because there are a lot of people who kind of like jump into open source in the mentality of using it rather than developing it because it's already developed and they have like super awesome developers. So there's those kind of projects are always in need of people who can build their user community and who can test the product and who can contribute in any way, shape, or form. Like you can contribute in the documentation part. So all these small things that people might think that they are not contributions can actually result to a very important contribution in a project. And that's how you kind of like get started. And once you're started, you will find people who would, help you to grow more in that community space. So it's really impressive that there are different kind of levels and ways one can get started. And I have tried all of them. So I'm like, that works. So yeah, that definitely works. So this is how, in my experience, anyone can get started with an open source project that they are interested in exploring.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think that's such an important message that open source projects are communities of people with different interests and different capabilities. And sometimes something that might seem very modest to a person, like just reporting a bug, reporting that something doesn't work or the documentation isn't clear, does an enormous service to the community. And it's one of many, many ways to get involved. So thanks for explaining that, Fatima, and your own journey into that community. Roberto, I'd like to turn to our fourth panelist, Roberto Rodriguez, and I'd like to know, Roberto, what's your take on how to get started? How would you recommend that someone who hasn't gotten involved in an open source community do that?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Roberto Rodriguez. I go by Cyberwar Dog in Twitter, and I'm also the creator of a lot of open source projects out there in the community. Founder of the Open Threads Research, also community as well, with the combination of a lot of different topics to do research on and also contribute to the community. I also work for the Microsoft Threat Intelligence team as well, part of the R&D branch. So that's the Mystic, it's the Mystic R&D team. And yes, so how to start? So there are, like a number of ways to get started in open source, but To me, like, it depends on your time, depends also on your personality, how you like to learn as well, right? Because not everybody learns the same way, right? But I'm going to discuss a few that, in my opinion, have a low, barrier, to entry. So, for example, like, first, like if you, let's say, are in school or you're already working, whatever your situation is, right? There is always a specific topic that you might be familiar with, specific type of technology that you might be, also more proficient in. So I believe that the first thing to do is to start exploring and identifying other open source projects that are related to that specific thing, that you might be, like a little bit more comfortable talking about. And I believe that that will definitely reduce the amount of time to do research up front, because it takes a lot of time to try to, figure out like these new ideas. So try to start with whatever you feel comfortable with, like explore, GitHub, right? Try to type a few words that are related with your current job, for example, right? Second, I believe that don't be afraid to just start small. Like, you don't have to create a complete open source project in order to feel that you're starting your open source career or your open source journey. Well, it's now as a career, right? Open source. But I believe that you can start very small. Like, try to identify, following step number one, identify those projects where you can start doing contributions, either in a form of code, in a form of documentation. For example, Fatima said, really good thing that sometimes is, your contribution is just a matter of saying, hey, this thing in the documentation could be improved. This is something that, for example, you haven't mentioned yet in the project. Those contributions are definitely, in my opinion, very helpful, not just for the creator, but for the contributor itself, because you start learning about that open source idea. And then finally, if you really want to start your journey, you have to also get familiarized with, for example, Git commands. Like, you have to learn your GitHub, right? Because, for example, there's a lot of things that I do every day, and there is always opportunities out there to, for example, send a pull request or try to, do a commit to the projects that I do. So I believe that just by knowing the basics, you will be very closer to starting your journey and trying to share what you're contributing with the world. Because it's great to work, like develop things on your own and working in your local computer. But the best thing is to start also, getting to know other communities that are also interested in the same topics that you're working on.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Roberto, and for that reminder that there's a tool you need to learn too, GitHub and Git. So that's very useful. And there may be, I imagine, some questions about that too that we can tackle about sort of how to get started with the tool chain that's necessary for this work. So if you have any questions like that, put them in chat or we can answer them afterwards. I think I will ask Doug to chime in on this question too briefly, because he's seen a lot of people get started in open source careers, and I know he has a strong position on it. So Doug, why don't you tell us what your position is?
Yeah, I've heard it said quite often in the world of computer science that if you want to learn a new programming language, you should have a problem that you're trying to solve. And I think that's a great, really kind of guiding point for us in terms of how you get started on your open source journey. I think it's important to have a problem to solve. You could go out and find some random open source project and you could install it and you could play around with it, but you're really only kind of scratching the surface. That's really kind of a superficial look at that open source project. I think what's a more comprehensive way to get started is to have a problem that you're trying to solve. For example, I mentioned earlier that I found out about open source software in 1997. And early on in 1998, I had a problem that I needed to solve. My organization needed a proxy server. We needed to monitor where users were going on the internet. So I learned about Squid proxy server. After that, we needed a firewall. So I learned about IP tables. Later on, we needed to be able to monitor network traffic. So I learned about Snort, Suricata, Bro, which is now Zeek, and all these things. So it was important to make these things real, to really put them into practice, to put them into production, and that makes it so much more of a real world use case, and that gives you a much deeper appreciation for the community, especially when you run into a a bug or a feature, and you have to ask the developers about it, or you have to read the documentation, maybe improve on the documentation, as we talked about earlier. But all of those things are key parts of an open source community, and it's really a great way to really jump into that deep end and get started on that open source journey.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that advice. Find a problem, dig into it, and solve it. Okay, I want to take a turn here towards a different topic. One premise of this panel is that open source can accelerate not only careers, but can also be a powerful engine for building a more diverse workforce in cybersecurity. And we really urgently need more diversity in cybersecurity in all of its manifold dimensions. I think that's apparent to most people who work in the field. And it occurred to me that open source can be an engine among many others that need to be brought to bear on this problem. So I thought I would ask Bernard to reflect a little bit about this angle of open source as an engine for increased inclusion and diversity.
Yeah, great question. I mentioned earlier that I was in a place where no matter what I tried, nothing seemed to be working. And that is born out of the heart of coming up in post-financial crisis inner city Detroit and trying to look for opportunities to do something that would give me both a life and a career worth living and working in. And open source for me meant I got to explore, right? That I could pick something up and that for no reason other than I wanted to do it or I wanted to learn it, it was available to me. And I think for the first time in my life that was what held true. And so I look at what's available through open source, and I look at this concept of diversity, whether it be in the lens of economic diversity, whether it be diversity of thought, whether it be diversity of just people in general, and I think about how we bridge that gap and allow for people in each of those different areas, no matter where they come from or what they have, to be able to find success. And this is the path, for no other reason than a kid wants to pick up something and learn it, they can do it.
Yeah.
And I think I'm a prime example of that. And so, going through this whole process, I found that there's two key themes. One, exploration and interest are powerful, but two, which is more importantly, is that those of us who have been able to learn and grow through open source, and some of this is happening already, but just the importance of and responsibility of mentorship and leadership, to be able to give back to those who you see may have an opportunity to grow or learn in this, or those that you see and understand may be struggling, that you can offer that guidance and that we can offer that leadership to say, look, you're almost there. This is how this open source project applies to you or what you have available, or here's a different open source thing that may be of interest. You're almost there and you will not believe what's possible once you get this nailed.
Yeah, thank you for that, Bernard, and for connecting that with your own life. I know you and I have spoken a little bit about community colleges as one potential ground zero for that transformation because they're low costs. They attract all sorts of people who attend according to their schedule, and a lot of them just highly motivated, really sharp. And I'm wondering if you think that that's a place where those who are interested in mentoring or enabling the transformations that you described could attach themselves to.
Absolutely. I would say between that and potentially high schools, if you think there's opportunity there, find someone who is interested and motivated and just show them what's possible.
Thank you so much. So, Doug, I'd love for you to reflect on the same question through the lens of your own experience, which is different in some ways, but also strikingly similar. So I thought it'd be great for the audience to hear your reflections about kind of the rural development aspect of open source.
Yeah, so I grew up on a little bitty dirt road outside of the little town of Augusta, Georgia. We recently hosted a golf tournament that folks might have heard of, but we're not really known for much else outside of the Masters Golf Tournament. We're certainly not a high-tech town. We're not Silicon Valley. We're not Washington, D.C. And so, growing up here in kind of a rural, kind of a sleepy town, all of my friends couldn't wait to get out of Augusta. And I always kind of figured that I would have to do the same if I wanted to work for a real company, or if I wanted to even start a real company. But open source, having been introduced to that in 1997, and a great example is just the world of I had always heard of this thing called Unix, but I could never afford to buy a Unix machine to play around with at my house. And if the organizations that I worked for didn't have Unix, then I could never get experience with that. But then when I learned about Linux in 1997, hey, here's a free version of Unix that I can play with and I can get experience with. And as Bernard talked about, I had that interest, that eagerness to learn, and I could use that passion, and there were no barriers to entry. So as long as I've got the passion and the drive, I can go out there and learn new concepts and learn new techniques. And it's just such a force multiplier to be able to not be restricted to the funds that you have available in your banking account, or the lack thereof, right? And so it's been absolutely transformative to allow open source to carry me far beyond what my meager bank account may have allowed me to do, or what the dirt road that I grew up on may have kind of led me to naturally.
Yeah, thanks so much, Doug. And for the record, you're still living around or in or around Augusta, is that right?
Augusta is my hometown. It has been for 40 something years now, and will continue to be.
Yeah, that's great. That's inspiring. Well, as we close the panel and turn towards questions, I wanted to give our panelists one more chance to maybe give some advice and to generate some takeaways for all of you listening. I'd like each of you in succession to offer a single piece of advice about how to move forward in an open source journey. And I think, Bernard, we'll start with you. What single piece of advice might you offer to our listeners and watchers today?
Excellent. Well, as I said, I'm a bit of a dreamer, so I like to figure out exactly what it is that I want or what I see in the future, and I apply that directly in my career. What is the next move I want to make? And if I work backwards from that and understand what the functional technical capabilities are that I need to get to that next place, maybe it's luck or maybe it's just the way that things are, but I've been able to find an open source project that goes directly in line with what that next step is. So if I was to afford any advice, it is determine where you want to go in your career, what that next step is, and then find an open source project that aligns with that and just start learning.
Great. Thanks so much. Roberto, over to you. What single piece of advice would you offer?
Yep. So in my opinion, as you progress in your journey, right, start transitioning from the contributor, right, being a contributor to being a creator, right? And just make sure that you understand your licensing, how you apply things to open source, right? That's always good to know. The other piece of advice for me would be that don't be afraid of reinventing the wheel. Don't be afraid to rebuilding something from the ground up, because you learn a lot by doing that. And the goal, of course, is not just to do the same thing and then just change the name of the project. But the idea is to understand what it is that you can integrate that project with. For example, I have created a lot of open source projects around other open source projects because they integrate very well. You try to identify opportunities for you to start developing open source, for example. And then also, so in my opinion, once again, don't forget to learn how to even use the tools like, GitHub and all this stuff. And I want to keep saying that because that's sometimes it's a big obstacle to start sharing, right? Because once again, you can build, you can do anything you want with open source, but if you cannot share it, then it's hard to start sharing, getting feedback and start building the community that you might want to build also around your own contributions. So because you don't might not even know, but you might be one pull request away from your journey, from your open source journey.
Yep, but you have to know how to do a pull request.
Exactly.
Exactly. Thank you, Roberto. Yep. That's great. Okay, so Fatima, what one piece of advice might you offer to someone listening to us today?
Okay, in middle of all the great advice, I would just say that be curious and ask a lot of questions and have fun. I mean, don't be scared and afraid that what happens. If you break things, great. Either you have found bug or you have discovered something new. So don't be afraid to jump and ask for help. And as I said, that be curious and ask a lot of questions, because you would be surprised that if you ask questions, there is open source community out there who is more than willing to help you take your first step, because they need you more than you need them, because that's all they're made up of, right? All the open source projects, great projects are made up of community, made up of people like you and me who contribute back to the project. Because if they don't have a community, they will not be growing and doing good in future. So just don't be afraid, don't shy, and ask a lot of questions and have fun, have some creativity, and jump in whatever interests you. Find a problem, jump right into it. If you do not find any open source project that supports a solution for your problem, you will be creator, you will be inventor, right?
Yeah.
So you will be the next bigger project. You will be the creator of the next bigger open source project. So just don't be afraid and be curious.
Yeah, that's great. It's advice sort of about a particular perspective, almost taking joy and just having zero defensiveness. And if I can embarrass you just a little bit, I'm reminded of when you sort of made your energetic appearance in the open source community that I participated in. And I want to say, Fatima, within like a year and a half, you were giving talks at the yearly conference. You would found a corner of the project that needed attention, documentation, and extension, and you were telling stories about how you made that contribution really quite rapidly. It happened. It happened pretty quickly.
Right. I can probably say that I wouldn't be where I am right now if it wouldn't be open source, and specifically Zeek. So I'm very proud user and kind of like teeny tiny contributor of that project. So I'm happy. I like what I
Yeah, more than teeny tiny for sure. Well, thank you so much. And Doug, why don't we end with you? We'll give you the last word, and then we'll move on to if there are any questions from the viewers. But let's start with some advice from you about how to get started.
Yeah, so a pragmatic process that I have used, that I've recommended to others, and I've seen been very successful for others, is a 3-step process, right? Step 1, in the first week after this conference, I want you to go and look in your organization that you're in and find a gap. What is it that you're missing? It might be that you're missing some network-based visibility. It might be that you're missing some host-based visibility. It might be that you need some help when it comes to incident response or case management. Whatever the case may be, you've got some kind of a gap in your environment. So in the first month after this presentation, I want you to find an open source project that helps you to fill that gap. And I want you to do a proof of concept of it. And hopefully your organization has like a lab environment. Even if you don't, make your home environment your lab, right? Set it up at home, get to know it, put it through its paces, learn it inside and out. And then step 3, in the months following that, take that proof of concept, turn it into production, and demonstrate a quick win to your management. And do this in a couple of ways. Show them that it's working the way that it should. Show them that it's saving them money. Get that documented in your annual review. That helps when it comes to salary reviews as well. And put that on your resume, and that helps you get better opportunities for the future outside of your organization as well. And as we've talked about, in addition to that, if you don't find an open source project that fills that gap, now you've identified an opportunity to start a brand new open source project. And that can open all kinds of doors, including starting your own company and really changing the trajectory of your career.
Awesome. Thank you, Doug. That's a very clear 3-part strategy for folks to adopt. And as he mentioned at the end, as Doug mentioned, there's sort of, if you find a project, that's great. You can contribute to it. If there's none, then there's a gap. So either outcome is really good. I want to thank all of our panelists so much for their candor and their thoughtfulness. This was an awesome discussion. I hope that you heard something here that inspired you or nudged you forward a little, pushed you forward, something that sticks in your brain. I sincerely hope so. And now it is time to hear from you. Our panelists would be happy to get feedback, obviously in chat, and perhaps we'll even have time to have some dialogue in real time. And if not, I'm sure that they'd appreciate being contacted out of band as well. You can read their bios for information about that. But in the meantime, thank you so much for attending our panel. And I truly hope that you find a meaningful relationship with an open source project in the future. Take care.